Hey, I'm Dylan, and in this video I'm going to be making an interesting little coffee table. The overall design is quite simple, but I'm going to be using some different sort of joinery and have that be part of the design and add some extra visual appeal that way. Usually joinery is something that I don't really care all that much about. It's there to hold everything together for the most part, but on this build I wanted to try something a bit different and actually feature the joinery. I'm starting out by using this Vic Ash, which is quite a plain timber. You can see from some of this end grain that it's really tight and it's quarter sawn, which means that any of the potentially interesting grain has essentially been removed in the milling process. This wood's generally really stable, which is great, but it's just not very visually interesting, so another reason to try and jazz it up somehow. These bits that I've just been cutting out are for the legs, and I'm going to be attaching them with bridal joints. And I recently made a new tenon jig, so I've just got to attach a new fence for cutting bridal joints. I'm cutting these mortises slightly shallower than the thickness of the mating piece. I've gone through why I do this in other videos, but it's essentially just to help make a neater joint and just avoid the potential of there being a little gap on the inside of the joint. And once I've finished cutting out the mortises, I can get started on cutting the tenons. After getting this process done at the table saw, I actually took it to the router table to hone in the fit, which gets it really tight. And that's sort of visible here from my out of focus shot. So as you can see here, there's that small shoulder at the top of the joint. And I can just take that back to the table saw, remove it in the same way, and it'll just mean that the inside of my joint will look nice and crisp and there won't be any small gaps or anything. Moving on with the next phase, I'm just going to make a small jig here to help round over the inside of these legs. Once that's been roughed out at the bandsaw, I can sticky tape my template back onto the leg and I'll just tidy it up with the router. And then once that reference edge has been established, I can take it to the router table and just finish it with my bigger bit. Annoyingly, my memory card filled up while I was doing this glue up, so I didn't capture it, but I ended up gluing both legs on top of each other with just some packing tape in between so they didn't stick to each other. And that just made sure that they were perfectly in line with each other. I was pretty keen to see what the joint looked like, so I just gave it a quick sand and it was looking pretty tidy. Cool joinery method number 2 was attaching the slats to the top, which required me to make a jig to cut a heap of dados. I'm cutting 2 parallel grooves in this piece of plywood by lowering my blade all the way down, then raising it back up again using the fence to hold it in the right position. This gap that's left is fairly arbitrary, but will be the width of the dado I end up cutting. So here I'm just finding the center point so that I can cut my first dado. I'm going to be working from the center outwards as opposed to cutting from one end to the other. It's just a much easier way of making sure things come out looking nice and even. The fence will act as a zero clearance on the inside of the joint, but I'm just adding a piece of wood here to avoid any blowout as the router bit comes through the other side of the cut. And I should have secured it a bit more tightly because it ended up slipping around a little bit, but it still served its purpose. Now that I've cut my first dado, I can add this space a bit. And this offset that I'm doing here is the distance that will be between the dados, if that makes sense. You'll see in a second. So that spacer slots into the first dado and locks it in place. I can clamp everything down, route a new dado, and then just continue working my way down the piece until all of the dados are cut. This ended up being quite a delicate process as the thin spines between the dados were really fragile, and I had a few blowouts, which those little bits of blue painter's tape allude to, but I was able to glue them back on and it was fine in the end. It was just a very slow and delicate process. Moving on to joint number 3, I'm going to be using wedged mortise and tenons to attach the 2 legs together. And it's a little bit hard to tell from these shots, but this mortise does actually go all the way through. This is the outside of the joint, and having used a knife and a marking gauge, it's pretty easy to clean this up with chisels. As long as I creep up on that knife line and don't go over it, I end up with a nice outer edge. And it doesn't really matter if the inside of the mortise isn't super neat, as that's going to be covered up by the tenon. Moving on to the cross rail, which I'm going to cut the tenon into. It's just more of cutting big bits down into smaller bits. And I can just cut the tendons into this the same way as I did for the long rails. And here I'm just creeping up on that final perfect fit with the router table. So making sure this joint is tight along the long faces of the tenon is the most important part. Because it's going to be wedged, it doesn't really matter if the short ends are a little bit sloppy, because when the wedges get driven in, it'll tighten up that part of the joint. I'm just doing a little dry fit here just to make sure everything fits nicely. And once I'm happy with that, I can cut a groove in the middle of these two pieces, and that's going to hold another stretcher once everything's been glued together. For the wedges, I'm using walnut, and that's going to just be a nice visual contrast against the lighter coloured Vic Ash. I'm adding a little shim here to that piece of walnut just so that it helps me cut the wedge shape. I've seen a few different methods of cutting wedges, and I think I'd actually probably use the bandsaw next time, as this ended up feeling a little bit sketchy, but it did end up working just fine. I'm just cutting the grooves here that the wedges will actually go into, and that little piece of wood that's sitting behind is just acting as a zero clearance. And I can finally get on with the glue up. It's a little bit of a fine dance putting these wedges in, because if you bash one wedge in too far, then the other can't go any further, and you run the risk of it looking a bit uneven. And as you can see, I sort of couldn't bash that bottom one any further, but luckily when I cut it off, it didn't look too uneven. So yeah, I got lucky with this one. So to attach the slats, I decided to use screws. I contemplated using glue, but I just thought it was just gonna be too much of a nightmare. Any squeeze out was just gonna be impossible to clean up. So here I'm just pre-drilling the holes whilst everything dried up. And for the slats, I'm going to be using some of this walnut, which will again add some nice visual contrast to the Vic Ash. I'm going to cut this in half and book match it, and I'll pretty much do anything to avoid changing my bandsaw blade. So I'm just doing as much as I can here at the table saw. I've got a really thin blade on my bandsaw, which is fine for cutting off a small bit like this, but it would struggle if it was trying to resaw this entire chunk. And after cleaning up the bandsaw marks at the thicknesser, I can start cutting this up into strips. Most slats fit fairly well straight off the table saw, but a few were a little bit tight, so a few swipes of the hand plane and that did the trick. again, I had to be really careful here because those spines are just so fragile, and if I tried to force those slats in too hard, they would have just snapped off. And a few gentle taps of the hammer and a tri-square just helped make sure that everything was nicely lined up. After finishing off screwing all these slats in, I could finally get around to cutting off these tenons. I'm cutting up this piece of walnut here, and that's going to be the stretcher that runs underneath the coffee table. It's completely structurally unnecessary, but I think it'll just look nice. And again, I'm just using a screw here to attach this. After giving everything a really good sand, I'm just going to finish this with a simple beeswax and linseed oil finish. After going through all the effort of book matching these panels, I was a little bit surprised that you couldn't really tell it had been book matched, but oh well. And here are some beauty shots of the finished product. Thanks for watching.